One. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the ToKids Podcast. Today, we are going to continue our discussion from last time, but with the added topic of including transgender people in our concept of gender and knowledge.
So when it comes to this topic, I think people have a lot of preconceived beliefs about gender and what's supposed to fit into each thing. And so when trans people exist and sort of question those beliefs that they already have, people are like, wait a second, I have to second guess, because I think a lot of people think that their ideas about gender are just knowledge. They think that they're based in facts that men and women are this way and they have to be this way, but the fact of the matter is that it's not, and it's not as clear cut as that. And so when it comes to trans rights, a lot of people have to reconstruct how they see gender and the knowledge that they believe that they had, and have to sort of realize okay, maybe I have to see things in a different way.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's because for a long time, gender was entirely grounded in sex. But that is becoming less and less the case in the modern era, where we see more trans people being very vocal that they exist, and more non-binary people existing in general.
Yeah, I agree with what both of you guys said on how the societal look on what gender and what sex is changing drastically, and I feel like it's benefiting everyone in all spectrums on where they lie on the gender spectrum and what they identify themselves with, because it's not like, oh, you're a woman, you're a man, and you have these certain roles, which these rules could be very harming to many and millions of other people who feel like they don't identify with that, or just simply don't want to fall into the stereotypical gender roles that society places on them.
Yeah, and I like how you use the word spectrum, because, gender is a spectrum. It's not just, just a man or just a woman. And I feel like that in that spectrum, there's a lot of things that we can't really explain about ourselves using labels, labels are used to, it can be a good thing. It can use to empower us and validate our identity. However, we are more than just our labels. Our identity is so much more than just the words that we apply to ourselves and how we describe ourselves. So in that way, labels can also be extremely restricting, especially when you want to explore your sexual orientation, or you want to explore what gender you identify as. And so did you guys ever have those moments where these labels and the expectations that comes with the labels affected you, and how did those labels affect you guys?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
The whole concept of womanhood is so far away from my brain, because it's so entrenched in okay, you have to like men, you have to have kids, you have to, be submissive, you have to do this and this, this checklist of what being a woman is. And so when you don't fit into that, it's really hard to reconcile what you actually fit into, because you can't look at the gender binary as these hard and stone things, because the way that we see gender is so entrenched in societal manifestations, things that we've made up, things that we've come up with as people. And so I feel like I was never able to look at it as clear cut as that. So that's where it was fuzzy.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, Corinne. I feel like womanhood has been forced upon me by societal standards, and things like, oh, you're gonna have to grow up, you're gonna have to fall in love, you're gonna get married, and then you're gonna have kids. It's that to me is, I'm sorry, my cat is right here. That to me is very overwhelming. Like,
Want to hear the cat's
like,
opinion too.
oh yeah, she's a woman. Like, she fully understands it. Like, she didn't want to just be born and get pregnant, and I understand that. Like, she wants to live her life, and I don't want to be just put in a box of just, oh, this is all you gotta do, and that's where you're gonna do it, and that's how you're gonna do it. Point blank, period. And that's not how I want to live my life. And I feel like I'm speaking on the behalf of everyone here. Like, there's boxes that they put us in and that we don't agree with or that we don't want to do. And that's okay. And I feel like as a society, as a generation, also, we're learning that and we're learning to break free from that. And we're also fighting for people who we don't really fully understand their position, but yet we understand what it feels like to be put in that box that we don't want to be put in.
I think I might bring a little bit of intersectionality into this because I feel like my specific experience with womanhood and like coping with that, I think applies more as a Black woman than just womanhood because I feel very feminine on my own. And like they've been difficult to cope with, but Black womanhood has been more because this ideal of like a strong Black woman or those specific expectations for us, I feel has really made it difficult to, I guess, cope with being a woman and being Black. It's a very, it stems from that, what you were talking about with knowledge and how you have to understand that a lot of these labels are, very exclusive, very constricting to how we really are, and that while it's nice to have this community and understand we went through the same experiences, it's also important to note that we have different experiences, different individual experiences.
Yeah, touching on that, as a Chinese, like Asian, East Asian kind of, I have the same experiences of where like the label to be like a Asian Chinese woman is to be like this whole idea that we are submissive, we're docile, we're supposed to serve men, and that like fetishization also like hinders like that label of being a woman. And then like the whole idea where women who don't want kids are labeled as selfish and like they only focus on themselves, and which is really crazy to see that like when a woman doesn't want to have kids, it's because they're selfish.
Mm-hmm.
So,
No.
oh, go ahead.
Okay. I was going to say, this idea of labels, do you think that the use of language in this way is ultimately good or ultimately bad? Because it definitely has its upsides as well. Like, someone very close to me in my life identifies as transgender, and they've told me that finding that label of transgender made a lot of their feelings like mesh well together. So what do you guys think about labels?
Having labels just ultimately puts you in a box, and you're forced to confine to these labels. Like, say, like how Kalea mentioned earlier, how all Black women are supposed to be strong and independent. Every single time somebody were able to go on and describe a Black woman, which is just something, it's just so categorical. We always have the word strong, cocoa chocolate queen, and that's always used over and over and over again.
It's
Why
true.
can't we just have somebody
It's
as
so
the way
true.
they are, instead of having preconceived concepts of how they're supposed to act and how they're supposed to be? And that's why certain aspects of our culture enforcing these gender norms are very damaging.
Yeah.
Iman,
No,
you were running.
go ahead.
You probably had a concise thought. I don't.
Concise thought. I mean, all right. But I was just gonna say that I feel like that how we constructed our language, it feels like our validation heavily is dependent on our language and our labels. Thus, if we find a word that fits us, we do feel empowered by that word and we feel like that we did find ourselves. But in a way, that aspect of language would also invalidates our feelings because we have this notion and this idea of qualia, of how we have these ineffable raw feelings that we could never truly explain and have, it's why we also have like that explanatory gap. And I feel like that even though language does validate us, that the fact that we rely on language for our validation is in a way restricting us from feeling our qualia and from experiencing that, rather than um, rather than relying on our feelings for our own validation, we rely on this word to label us and give us a role. And yeah.
Well, I feel like, especially our generation, we sort of recognize that, like, language can be very restricting. So, to like close that I can't speak.
Explanatory gap.
Explanatory.
Thank you. Explanatory gap. We like create these new words. We create slang. We create these words that have a different meaning, and we sort of change it. Like, I want to use the word entanglement, right? So when you're in entanglement with someone, you're not in a relationship, but yet when I use that word entanglement, it's like a intimate relationship with someone. But you don't want to use the word intimate relationship because you don't want to say it's like so like scandalous or something. Like, it's more casual when you say, "Oh, I'm in an entanglement with someone." So,
Or I'm talking
I
to
feel like
someone.
Entanglement? I feel like
or
that's
you're talking to someone.
yeah, that's
Like-
simple.
That's
But
very casual.
That's casual.
Like, just to express how casual your entanglements with someone is. And I just feel like we use these words and we create these words to fill that qualia, to fill that like void that language has. And going back to what you said, Jackson, like, I feel like language and these labels, yes, they could be a good way to help find ourselves or to express ourselves, but yet it also can be restricting what you said, Yvonne. But I feel like that really depends on who you are as a person, because if someone else gives me a label, I'm gonna be more like, I'm not gonna really like it. But if I give myself a label, I'm going to be like, yes, that's who I am. If someone else calls me dramatic, I get offended. But if I call myself dramatic, I'm like, oh yeah, that's just who I am. Because I wanted to choose that label for me. That's how I wanted to identify myself. And I didn't want anyone else to come in and tell me that, because that's giving me the implications of an insult.
Yeah.
But
Okay.
I feel
think,
like that adds to slang words and like taking that back, like taking back, I guess, like Black people taking back the N word or whatever, because it kind of gives us control of our own, I guess, description and our own characteristics, and creating that label that has that community.
Yeah.
Oh,
So
Cindy, were you gonna talk or?
Yeah.
yeah.
yeah, it looks like Cindy wanted to say
Okay.
something.
no,
Okay,
it's fine.
I was gonna-
I was just gonna say,
No,
No,
go,
just say.
Cindy, go.
I was gonna just say that, like, in our society, like, our labels aren't usually given by ourselves, but like placed by stereotypes and how everybody else views us. So I think I don't agree with labels. I think we don't really need them. You should just be yourself, and you shouldn't have a specific label to fit into. You know what I mean? You should just do you without being into a label, but.
So, would you guys agree with the statement that self-defined labels provide a net good, whereas other defined labels provide a net bad to the self?
When you say other bad labels, you mean
like
wait,
self
other
versus other?
Defined by the other.
Okay.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, it's nice to. It depends on who that other is, and if they like. I don't know if they're closer to you. Like if my mother gave me a label, I don't know. because if someone is observing you, it's always nice to consider what other people think of you and how you might not notice this of yourself. So if someone says like, "Oh, you're very, I don't know, quiet," but I don't think of myself as quiet, then it's like, oh, I can always like look at, to know a new side of myself. But other than that, I feel like self-labels are way more important. It always comes down to if you identify with that label, because if you don't, then, would you really consider it as you?
I think
So I don't really agree with labels. Oh,
I think when it comes to like self-labeling, I feel like I think it's better because every individual has like a more nuanced understanding of themselves than other people have of them. So like they can take into consideration those things, whereas external labels oftentimes are based on stereotypes like you guys were talking about earlier. So I think that's more often why like externally given labels that are given to us aren't as good because they usually have a very one-dimensional understanding of our personality, what we are. So it's really fun.
Cindy, go.
I think by labeling yourself, you're kind of justifying other labeling. If you play into that game. So by being okay with labeling yourself, you're kind of just continuing that process of getting a label and being stuck in that box and stereotype.
I can understand that. I'm going to use an example that's completely off the topic, but with introvert and extrovert, recently I've just like figured out that I'm more introverted and I'm not like an ambivert or whatever in the middle. And I felt that I wasn't an introvert because I'm more talkative than the regular introvert, I guess. But labeling myself as such, or I didn't want to identify with that label because it didn't fit me fully, but I feel like labeling myself as such has allowed me to, have a community of my shared experiences, which is always really nice. And I feel like labels provide that. But when labels get too restrictive is when you, I guess, give them too much power, I feel. Like labels ultimately don't define you. You have outlier experiences in your life, and that's not going to be able to be labeled by something. So labels are important for community and just finding, I guess, validation with other people, which is never like wrong unless you make it too extensive.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with Kalea as well, because labels are a tool that we have in our language in order to like help us understand ourselves, but they can become harmful when you try to force yourself entirely into that one box.
Yeah, I really
Yeah.
like. Oh, okay.
No, you can go. I'm just saying yeah.
Oh. Yeah, I agree with both Cindy and Kalea because I really love Kalea how you pointed out like the shared experiences and like shared knowledge and personal knowledge. Like I didn't even think of that. Like how it brings a community together and we have all these like similarities and we can work together as a society and as a community. But I do agree with Cindy that labels are harmful when it comes to personal knowledge because you when you're trying to find like what is this feeling, like what am I feeling right now, you find that label and you're like, oh, I'm self-validating myself, I can now perceive myself as this one thing. While that is empowering and validating, it can also it denies you of your qualia because when you're trying to search for that word that fits you, you're denying your qualia and what you truly feel rather than allowing yourself to you know embrace those feelings and the emotions that you have within you. You instead try to find that word that fits into the emotions and the feelings that you have because for example, uh, I want to bring up bisexuality. So in bisexuality, like the prefix bi, it implies or it defines, the person likes both genders, male and female. However, when you say bi, it implies as if you like those genders like 50-50, when in actuality, when someone identifies as bisexual, they can like one gender like 70% and the other gender 30%. So even though identifying yourself as, bisexual, you're like, oh, it's freeing. I know that now my feelings of liking both men and women are validating. But then when you find yourself, oh, I actually prefer men over women, does that mean that I'm straight? Am I lying to myself? Am I actually did I just tell everyone who I said that, I was bi? Like, did I lie to them as well? So it can be freeing at the moment, but in your personal knowledge and as you go through your journey and your personal journey, you find out that, that label can actually be harmful to you and deny your true feelings and qualia.
To expand on that, Kayla, you were going.
Okay, thanks. Thanks. I think it's all the product language, as Yvonne was saying, how bi, she thought it signified 50-50, when in actuality, it probably means it's probably going to be an uneven amount. You guys never brought up the word signified and signifier, and I feel like that's a really important term to use when it comes to labels, because the signifier can be built upon many, 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 many centuries of things that are forced onto that word, and I thought that was something I should bring up. But you could go on, Kalia.
Oh, I was going to just expand upon that example of bisexuality. I also feel like micro labels gets to a point where, that affects your personal knowledge, because I mean, under the bisexual label, there's a lot of micro labels like pansexual or polysexual. And while this is very helpful to identify with the community, it could also be very damaging, because when you're finding yourself, you feel like you have to find a label that, like you're not lying and you don't want to have to, I guess, come out again. It's very limiting and restrictive once you micro label yourself.
Yeah, and I like how you brought up micro labels as well, because this kind of goes to what Aaliyah was saying on how like we're trying to fill that void, that explanatory gap. But the truth is that we're never going to fill that explanatory gap. It will always be there. I know you're gonna hate me for this, but it's like asymptotes. You can only those like asymptotes can only get so close, but they never cross each other. They never touch. So as much as we as much as we want for our words to, close that gap, it will always be there and it will never cross. So there will always be that barrier, and not putting more and more labels will not close that gap. Instead, it just perpetuates it.
Exactly, because people can always, I guess, interpret how they expect you to be through labels. Through any label, they can assign you labels. You can assign yourself labels, and people will always have the freedom to interpret your labels. Even if you do have a micro label that says explicitly what you are, they could always go beyond that. So there's always going to be that explanatory gap.
Yeah, I think that connects back to what Kayla was saying with the signifier and the signified, because the signifier, even if you're creating like new words that you think mean like this, and that, the signified is never going to be exactly what you would think it is to another person. It's always going to be subjective. They're always going to take words in different directions. And so the signified of these micro labels, even though people like to believe that it's super specific, really it can't be, because the signified is never like objective one.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead. No, go ahead, everyone.
No. Are you gonna bring
No,
up?
I was gonna close it out. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. So one final thing. It also, it relates back to what we started with transgender, and how the definitions of gender and sex are ever evolving, especially gender, because before people were looking at it at a scientific way. Gender is, it's what it's your gender
What
is
you're born with.
Yeah, what you're born with, like your genitalia basically. But now it's expanded into something more than that. It's what we identify as. It's what we identify what our gender is, rather than,
It's more personal.
yeah, it's more personal, and it turned more into like this teleological way of like, who do I identify as?
Mm-hmm.
All right, and that seems like a good place to end it off. Thank you all for listening, and thank you all for being here and participating. This has been the ToKids Podcast, episode 3.
All right, bye.
Bye.
Bye.